It began on an ordinary Sunday morning in early May, just outside the quiet farming town of San Rafael, Texas. The sun had barely risen over the endless rows of rose bushes when a strange shimmer appeared in the air. Soft, golden, almost like the reflection of water. The workers stopped. The air grew still. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then someone whispered, "Do you see her?" There, above the blooms heavy with dew, a faint outline of a woman seemed to glow. Blue mantle, white veil, hands folded in prayer. The fragrance of roses, already strong in that field, suddenly deepened into something almost heavenly. Maria Gonzalez, the owner of the small farm, dropped the pruning shears from her hand. She had lived her whole life among roses, but she had never seen light move like that. Alive, pulsing, gentle. The figure lingered only a moment, then dissolved into the morning mist, leaving the workers shaken and silent. Was it the Virgin Mary? Was it just the play of sunlight and dust? That day, the roses in Maria's field began to bloom all at once. Every single bud opening within hours, painting the valley crimson and gold. And before sunset, word had already spread across the county. Something miraculous was happening on that little Texas farm. San Rafael was the kind of Texas town you could pass in 5 minutes without noticing. A single gas station, a small white church, and miles of dusty roads lined with pecan trees. Life moved slowly there, to the rhythm of sun, soil, and prayer. Maria Gonzalez had lived in that same patch of land all her life. Her grandparents came from Mexico in the 1940s, bringing with them a single tradition that never faded. Every May, they planted roses in honor of the Virgin Mary. Maria grew up among those flowers, their scent mingling with her childhood memories. The sound of her father's guitar at dusk, her mother's whispered prayers in Spanish, Ave Maria, llena eres de gracia. By the time she turned 40, Maria was running the entire rose farm alone. Her husband had passed away years earlier in a highway accident, leaving her with a teenage daughter, Isabel. The farm became her refuge. And her burden. She worked from dawn until the stars came out, pruning, watering, harvesting. Each morning, before touching a single flower, she knelt by the small stone statue of Our Lady that stood at the edge of the field. Its paint had faded from years of sun, but the face remained gentle, serene, unbroken. Locals often said Maria was the woman who prayed more than she spoke. She didn't talk much about her faith, but she carried it quietly, like the soil beneath her feet. Steady, unseen, necessary. In early 2024, things began to change. The drought hit hard, prices fell, and one by one, the farms around San Rafael closed down. Yet Maria's roses somehow survived, fragile but alive. She told friends she didn't know why, only that the Blessed Mother never left this field. No one realized then that her words would soon become literal. Before the miracle, there was only work, worry, and silence. Maria's days began before dawn. The sound of the old kettle, the creak of the porch, and the smell of damp earth. Her daughter, Isabel, 17, would help her tie the bundles of roses before heading off to school. Their bond was quiet but strong. They had learned to speak through gestures. A touch on the shoulder, a shared smile, the way Isabel would hum a hymn while sorting the petals. Maria often said her daughter had inherited her father's heart, kind, stubborn, always looking toward the light. But in the spring of that year, Isabel began to feel weak. At first, it seemed like exhaustion from helping on the farm. Then came the fevers, the dizziness, the nights when she could barely breathe. Doctors in Lubbock ran tests and gave names Maria couldn't pronounce. An autoimmune disorder, rare, unpredictable. They said there was no clear cure. Maria tried to stay strong. She prayed every night in front of the small Virgin Mary statue in the garden, whispering the same plea, "Please, keep my daughter safe." She lit candles until her fingers trembled. The wax dripped like tears onto the wooden table. As the days passed, the roses began to wilt early that season. Their colors faded faster, their stems bent as if bowing under invisible weight. Maria took it as a sign, one she didn't want to believe. Sometimes she would find Isabel sitting near the window, staring at the fields, her pale hands tracing invisible shapes in the air. "Do you think God still listens, Mama?" the girl asked once. Maria's throat tightened. She forced a smile. "He always does, mi amor, even when we don't feel him." But deep down, Maria wondered if she still believed her own words. By late July, the Texas heat had turned merciless. The sky was a white blaze, the soil cracked, and even the most stubborn roses on Maria's farm began to curl and brown. Inside the small wooden farmhouse, Isabel's condition worsened. Her once bright eyes were now shadowed by exhaustion. Nights were the hardest. The slow beeping of the monitor, the sound of her labored breath, the silence that followed every whispered prayer. Maria tried everything. She sold her jewelry to afford another round of treatment in Lubbock. She called every doctor, every clinic. But each visit ended the same: polite smiles, kind words, and no answers. One evening, as thunder gathered over the horizon, Maria stood by the window, watching the first drops of rain hit the field. Relief washed over her. Finally, some mercy for the parched earth. But within minutes, the gentle rain became a storm. The wind tore through the fields, bending the rose bushes flat to the ground. Hailstones the size of marbles pelted the blossoms, shredding petals that had taken months to nurture. By morning, the once beautiful field lay ruined. A sea of broken stems and muddy water. Maria stepped outside barefoot, her dress soaked, her hands trembling. She dropped to her knees in the center of the field. "Why, Lord," she cried, "why take everything? The flowers, the rain, my child's strength." The statue of the Virgin Mary at the field's edge had toppled in the storm. Its face was streaked with mud. For the first time, Maria couldn't bring herself to stand it upright. She simply turned away, whispering bitterly, "You don't listen anymore." That night, she didn't light her candle. She didn't pray. The house was silent except for the weak coughs of her daughter and the steady hum of the wind through the broken windows. For the first time in her life, Maria felt truly alone. Not just in her house, but in her faith. 3 days after the storm, the air above San Rafael was still heavy and strange. A humid quiet that felt almost sacred. The field lay in ruins, petals turned brown, water pooling in the furrows. Maria hadn't gone out since that night. She couldn't bear to see the damage. But on the fourth morning, a fragrance began to drift through the open window. Faint at first, then stronger, richer, unmistakable. Roses. Fresh, blooming roses. Maria frowned. That couldn't be right. She stepped outside barefoot, the mud cool beneath her feet. The sun was just rising, painting the wet fields gold. Then she saw it, in the center of the field, the very spot where she had cried and cursed. One single rose bush stood upright. Its petals were untouched, shining with dew, impossibly alive, and from its branches came that fragrance. Not earthy or sweet like before, but deep, almost unearthly. She bent down, touched one of the petals. Warm, not from sunlight, but as if from a heartbeat. A soft wind moved through the field, stirring the ruined flowers, and for a moment Maria thought she heard something. A whisper, gentle and distant, like a woman's voice carried by the breeze. Neighbors later said they, too, smelled the roses that morning, from as far as a mile away. One farmer told his wife he saw a thin veil of light hovering over the Gonzales field, though he couldn't explain it. Maria said nothing to anyone. She simply cut the single perfect rose, placed it in a glass of water beside Isabel's bed, and whispered, "If you're here, if you truly are, please don't leave us now." That night, Isabel slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. By the following weekend, the talk of the smell of roses had spread through San Rafael like wildfire. People from neighboring farms began stopping by Maria's gate, pretending to check on her, but secretly hoping to see something for themselves. One of them was Tomas Rivera, a retired school teacher and amateur photographer who had lived in town for over 40 years. On Saturday morning, just after sunrise, he parked his old pickup near the Gonzalez property and set up his camera. "If something strange really happens here," he told his wife, "I want to see it with my own eyes." At 6:47 a.m., the light returned. It started as a soft shimmer. The same golden haze the workers had described a week earlier. But this time, it lasted longer. The air above the rose field began to glow with a bluish hue, swirling gently like mist touched by sunlight. Tomas lifted his camera and took several photos. Through the lens, the light seemed to take shape. A faint figure, standing among the roses, draped in what looked like a flowing mantle. He snapped 3 more shots before the glow faded away. When he developed the photos later that day, his hands shook. In the 3rd frame, the light was clearly outlined, a woman in white and blue, her hands folded in prayer, a faint crown of light above her head. Word spread fast. People gathered outside Maria's farm, whispering prayers, lighting candles, some even kneeling in the dirt. A few skeptics called it a trick of the sun, but those who were there swore the air had changed. Warmer, brighter, filled with peace, Maria didn't ask for visitors. She simply stood at the edge of her ruined field, holding Isabel's hand, and said quietly, "Whatever this is, it belongs to her." On the evening of May 13th, the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, the sky over San Rafael burned with the colors of sunset, crimson, gold, violet. The whole town seemed to glow. Maria had spent the day avoiding the field, overwhelmed by the attention, the visitors, the reporters who had already begun to call. But as night approached, something in her heart stirred. Isabel had fallen asleep early. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Before closing the door, Maria whispered a small prayer she hadn't said in weeks. "Mother of God, if you truly are here, show me how to believe again." She walked barefoot into the field. The ground was still damp from the storm. Crickets sang in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of roses once more. Then, without warning, everything fell silent. Even the wind stopped. A soft light bloomed at the center of the field, exactly where the single rose bush had survived. It grew brighter, spreading outward like ripples on water. Maria shielded her eyes. And then she saw her. The Virgin Mary stood among the roses, radiant yet gentle, her blue mantle flowing as if moved by an unseen breeze. Her eyes were full of compassion, her hands folded in prayer. There was no fear, no blinding force. Only peace, vast and real. Maria fell to her knees, trembling. "Isabel," she whispered through tears, "please help my daughter." The figure smiled. A smile that seemed to carry every sorrow, every hope ever whispered by a mother. Then, in a voice as soft as the wind through petals, she said, "Your child will live, but more than that, your faith will bloom again, as these roses will." A warmth spread through Maria's chest, flowing into her arms, her hands, and into the soil beneath her. The roses around her began to stir, buds unfolding in seconds, the field lighting up with color as though dawn had come again. The vision faded slowly, leaving behind only the scent. In a silence so full of life, it felt like music. Maria stayed there for a long time, her tears falling onto the newly opened roses, whispering over and over, "Gracias, Madre mia." Thank you. When Maria finally returned to the house that night, her clothes were damp with dew and her hands still trembled from what she had seen. She didn't tell anyone. She simply walked straight to Isabel's room, still lit by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Her daughter slept soundly, color back in her cheeks for the first time in months. The glass beside her bed still held the single rose Maria had placed there days before. But now its petals were open, fresh, as if newly cut. Maria sat beside her, took her hand, and whispered, "Sleep, mi amor. The mother has come." At dawn, Maria woke to a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. Laughter. Isabel was sitting up, smiling weakly but wide-eyed, her voice steady. "Mama, I dreamed of a lady in blue," she said. "She told me not to be afraid anymore." Maria froze. "What did she look like?" she asked, her voice shaking. "She was beautiful," Isabel whispered, "and she smelled like roses." Within days, Isabel's strength returned. The doctors were baffled. Her fever vanished, her blood tests came back normal, and there was no trace of the illness that had nearly taken her life. "It's medically impossible," one physician admitted. "But she's completely healed." Meanwhile, the rose field outside the Gonzalez home had transformed. Every bush that had been shredded by the storm now bloomed in perfect symmetry. Thousands of blossoms, red, white, and pink, as if nature itself had started over. News spread across the county again, but this time it wasn't rumor. It was testimony. Maria, holding her daughter's hand, stood quietly among the flowers as neighbors arrived in silence, some crying, some praying, none doubting that something beyond explanation had touched that soil. Within a week, San Rafael was no longer the quiet town it had always been. Cars lined the dusty road leading to Maria's farm. Journalists, parish priests, and curious travelers came from across Texas, drawn by whispers of the Lady in the Field of Roses. Father Andrew McCarthy, the parish priest from nearby El Paso, was the first to arrive officially. A calm, gray-haired man with the patience of someone who had seen too many miracle stories turn out false. He came with skepticism and a camera of his own. When he met Maria, she didn't speak much. She only led him to the field. The roses were still in perfect bloom, untouched by insects or heat. Father Andrew bent down, touched one of the petals, and immediately noticed the faint scent of myrrh. Not perfume, but something ancient, holy. He took samples of the soil and petals to send for laboratory testing. He interviewed Maria, Isabel, and Tomas Rivera, the photographer who had taken the famous pictures. The photos were analyzed and showed no signs of digital manipulation, no reflection, no lens flare consistent with sunlight at that hour. 2 weeks later, the Diocese of El Paso released a cautious statement. "The Church does not declare miracles lightly. However, we acknowledge that the events in San Rafael cannot be explained by natural causes at this time." That single sentence changed everything. Pilgrims began to arrive from as far as New Mexico and Louisiana. The little road to Maria's farm turned into a stream of candles, prayers, and rosaries. Local newspapers published headlines like, "Our Lady appears in Texas farmland." Maria, overwhelmed by the crowds, simply told Father Andrew, "I didn't ask for people to come, but maybe she did." He nodded, crossing himself softly. "Then perhaps," he said, "she came for all of us." By midsummer, San Rafael was no longer the same town it once was. What had been a sleepy farming community turned into a place of quiet pilgrimage. Every evening, when the sun dipped behind the cottonwood trees, people gathered along the fence of the Gonzalez farm, holding candles and singing Ave Maria in English and Spanish. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation. Parents with sick children, farmers struggling through drought, young people who had lost their faith. Yet, regardless of why they came, almost everyone left with tears in their eyes and peace in their hearts. The mayor eventually closed the dirt road to cars, turning it into a walking path called Camino de las Rosas, the Way of Roses. Local volunteers built a small open-air chapel at the edge of Maria's field, where the old statue of the Virgin, once cracked and faded, now stood restored. The same statue that had fallen during the storm now seemed almost luminous under the evening light. Father Andrew began celebrating Mass there every Sunday. The first time he lifted the Eucharist, a light breeze moved through the field, carrying the fragrance of roses. Many swore they felt a warmth on their faces. Not from the sun, but something deeper. Maria never tried to profit from the attention. She refused donations, saying simply, "This land doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to her." Over time, healings began to be reported. Small, quiet ones. A boy's chronic asthma disappeared. An elderly woman said her sight returned enough to read her Bible again. None of these made national headlines, but in San Rafael, faith had returned to life. The roses, once a livelihood, had become something far more sacred. Living witnesses to a miracle that no drought, storm, or doubt could erase. Months passed, and the roses continued to bloom. Even through the cool breath of autumn, pilgrims still came, but Maria spent most of her time in silence, tending the fields as she always had. Only now, every movement felt like a prayer. When asked by a visiting journalist what she thought had truly happened, Maria didn't speak right away. She brushed a fallen petal from her apron and said softly, "It wasn't about me. It was about learning to trust again." She looked toward the statue at the edge of the field, the same one that had once lain broken in the mud. Its face now seemed radiant under the Texas sun. "I thought God had forgotten me," she continued. "When the storm came, I thought my faith was buried with the flowers. But she came to remind me that faith doesn't die. It just waits to bloom again." Her daughter Isabel now helped guide visitors through the rose fields, smiling with the vitality of someone given back a second life. Every evening, before sunset, the two women knelt together before the small chapel and prayed the rosary in both English and Spanish, sometimes joined by strangers who had once come only to see and stayed to believe. When Maria finished each prayer, she always whispered the same words, "Mother of God, let me never forget the day you walked among the roses." And as dusk fell across the Texas plain, the scent of those roses, faint but unmistakable, would rise once more, like a breath of heaven lingering over the earth. They say miracles leave behind a trace, not always in photographs or records, but in hearts that begin to hope again. In San Rafael, Texas, that hope still lingers in the scent of roses, in the quiet prayers whispered at dusk, in the faces of those who come seeking the same light that once shone over a field of flowers. Maybe the Virgin Mary didn't choose a cathedral or a crowd. Maybe she chose a weary mother on a forgotten farm, to remind us that heaven often touches earth where faith seems most fragile. And perhaps that's the real miracle. Not only that Isabel was healed, but that Maria and everyone who heard her story learned to believe again. So tonight, wherever you are listening from, take a moment to breathe, to pray, and to remember that miracles still bloom for those who have not stopped hoping. If this story touched your heart, tell us where you're watching from and share how the Virgin Mary has blessed your life. And don't forget to subscribe so that more souls may find faith through the miracles she continues to bring. Ahab Miracles.